start with is the big bad world of databases, which has a lot more money in it, but also has a lot of cool technology trends. So how many people like, this buzzword, big data? Like, do you have a real concrete idea in your mind what big data means? If someone were to say, are you qualified to be a big data person? Would you be able to say yes? All right, so like all good buzzwords, everyone can say it without actually meaning anything specific. So I think big data is something specific, and I think, let's go through what the database world has been doing over the last 3 decades. So in the 90s, we realized that it's really important when someone buys something on a website that you don't screw it up and forget that that person paid you with a credit card, etc. So we had, systems that were pretty ad hoc becoming really concerned about things like the ACID model, where you maybe can commit to a transaction, and that is absolute guarantee not to fail, and the state of everything in your system is, sound and guaranteed. And so we had a bunch of database technology and database companies, and we started to have e-commerce, and we started to have a whole bunch of business processes and business logic, which had all these structured queries, and all, the SQL language wasn't even invented or standardized until 1995, for goodness sakes. It's not that old. All that happened in the 90s. So that's like the SQL era, right? And then in the 2000s, young kids with, hoodies on are like, screw that, I'm just like scaling with my fingertips here. I'm in the zone, and they just sort of run with whatever they needed to make their website work. And it wasn't necessarily the same level of, I need consistency now when you click that button, right? When you click post on Facebook, does the entire world need to have a consistent view of what your post is? No, eventually, but like not at this exact second. The entire Facebook relational database server does not need to stop until everyone agrees that you just posted, a cat photo, right? So then they realize, well, okay, if I'm really in the distributed model by nature, which anything at scale has to be as soon as it doesn't fit on a single machine, and that's kind of what the web scale era was about, is nothing fits on a single machine. You have to be distributed, you have to be geographically distributed, but also your data just simply physically doesn't fit on a machine. What kind of database system supports this out of the box? Well, Oracle, which you're a web startup, you don't have the money for, or I sort of hack it together with things like eventual consistency. And it turns out you can build some pretty fast systems this way, right? So when you do post to Facebook, it only eventually gets to your phone or your friends' phones, etc. It doesn't synchronously do that. But they also are like, well, why do I need to have this other whole thing? This whole SQL table model system is very heavyweight for what I need. I'm basically just storing a little blob of data. Let's put it in a key value format like JSON, and I can get back that at any time. And in fact, I can even query over a whole bunch of these if I know what my keys are, or my set keys, or my sub keys, or whatever. So you start to have sort of this growing exploration into what kind of things do you actually need in large-scale systems that are just getting a lot of streaming data going through it. A lot of that isn't worth a lot individually. You're not like transaction-oriented credit card processing. You're liking posts on Facebook. The other big thing that really happened, though, is at the hardware level, people who were running things like banks realized that distributed was hard, so they would put stuff on really, really big machines. They didn't have to do distributed, mainframes. But commodity web startups would never do that. Same reason they wouldn't buy Oracle. They would just buy really, really cheap hardware and get lots of them, right? They would fail. They needed support failure. But the profile of what machines could look like in this architecture changed, right? Because all of a sudden, a 64 gigabyte server was not a ridiculous thing to think about. Then 128 gigabyte, a 512 gigabyte server in terms of memory was not ridiculous to think about. Well, if you have that much memory, why do you need to be using this really, really slow spinning mechanical disk? If you actually care about things like how many billions of likes can I pump through my system, well, screw the disk. Just go straight with memory. Lots of commodity hardware, lots of cheap memory. All those guys in Asia are driving down the price of this like crazy, and they're manufacturing these really, really, really fast pieces of silicon. So that's what the entire architecture of some of these new systems end up being based on, is use cheap hardware, use memory like crazy, and none of this looks like this 1990s era technology. Well, it turns out the one really, really good thing about that 1990s era technology is the fact that you can say, select my records in this city, group by age and gender, and give me a nice chart. Boom, right? SQL is a high-level language. It figures out all of that. It does pre-processing. It does query planning. It knows which tables to grab. It knows how to do things like group by and aggregates and sums, and how to do inner joins and outer joins. All that stuff at a low level, if it's pushed down to the storage engine, can run really, really fast. And when you're doing things on these big, really just lots of JSON blobs, it's not fast. And it's really hard to get something like tell me, how many people in Bozeman between 20 and 23 might want to buy my ad. Or Chipotle, which is coming to town apparently, because we need more burritos. So then basically there's a business opportunity here, right? All this commoditized stuff, you got a bunch of hackers in Silicon Valley who probably use that, but if you want to just buy something off the shelf to do millions of transactions a second, and have streaming analytics and things like SQL that run on it, there's a whole set of technologies that are starting to be called the new SQL technology stacks, and they leverage the fact that computers can have a terabyte of RAM for not too much money in terms of business terms. I mean, $10,000 for a server is cheap, and you can get a crazy amount of RAM on a server. Why use spinning disk as your limiting throughput? You don't. You end up doing a very different type of architecture. So that's I think where we are now, is utilize the cheap stuff, focus on the analytics, make SQL still something that works on this backend, and then you just sort of explore how does the backend work? Well, your distributed architecture, we do care about things like consistency, especially when you're running things like retail shops and you are running transactions. And now these transactions for things like Amazon, for Walmart, online retails, are at the same scale. And so they can start to do this not on giant mainframes, but on commodity hardware with really slick new database technology. So I think that's kind of what the trends are. So the big data world was really just this exploration into the distributed, which was a good idea, the schemaless, which wasn't really making sense in a lot of senses, because you still need to be able to run queries on it. And then the idea of key value pairs, well, that's great, but that doesn't necessarily mean you want to store your millions of pieces of data in JSON, and then have to do something like MapReduce to get anything out of it. So then there's this great talk that I went to, actually not a talk, podcast that I listened to while stacking wood for the winter, that covered, I think, what is now the new database market. I think markets are interesting because essentially it means people are spending large chunks of money putting their livelihoods into startups or enterprise scale software solutions. So it kind of defines, I'm a capitalist, I think it's really interesting where people spend money and where people invest in trying to build technology. And I think these are the three big segments very fairly captured what database world looks like now. There are still people who are building, OLTP stands for online transactional processing. Right? So if you go to Walmart.com and you enter the credit card, you're most likely interacting with still what looks like a traditional relational database. You enter query, guarantees asset level compliance that went into a system, a transaction was recorded, etc. But it's now starting to be in a very large distributed system. Now, obviously, if you're running thousands or hundreds of thousands of transactions, a second or a minute, you could still be using this, but this is really a commoditized stack. I mean, all this stuff is free. The people who are building commercial versions of this are talking about running, terabytes of data through analytical pipelines. All this is live data coming from, the point of sales transactions of Walmart. Walmart actually does a live stream analysis every time that an item gets scanned. It goes all back to their central headquarters, and they're running one of these types of systems like VoltDB, which just does distributed stream-based analysis while still keeping that consistency requirement of ACID and things like that. So a lot of these systems are all based on big memory stores. But there's another completely different mindset, which is, okay, I don't care at the moment that the transaction happens, what person did this or that, but I want to start learning from the data I'm collecting. This data science and big data analysis and being smart with your business data, all these trends basically means running offline analytics, machine learning, predictive modeling, being able to say which people are going to buy which things tomorrow so I can stock my shelves, etc., etc. Who do half the economy seems to be going that route. Who do I put ads in front of their screens, on their big screens, on their small screens, on their watch screens? All that types of analytics you do in an offline mode, and it turns out you don't use the same database technology that's your front end receiving this data that you want to use for analyzing it. And the offline mode isn't, basically there's a whole stack of technologies around data warehousing, which is about transforming all of these various places you might receive, the inputs from your website, from your logs, from your sales team, from your HR team, from your operations team about the weather or whatever, and you put that all into a single store that you can do offline analytics, machine learning, and even just basic queries. Being able to say how much money did we make, and broken down by person, by state, whatever, right? So then there's a whole bunch of these types of engines, and it's really interesting. Amazon came into the fray by doing what they did, which is essentially take something that looked like a super high-end, expensive enterprise thing and make it look like a dirt cheap commodity you can buy by the hour. And that's what they did with Amazon Redshift. And it's a really interesting technology stack, but they basically bought an existing commercial company and then sort of integrated their stack into this SaaS-oriented model where you're basically just paying for Amazon compute power, but it's nearly as powerful and scalable as some of these players that you literally cannot buy for less than $100 million. So it's really democratizing the ability for anybody to throw a terabyte of raw data onto their system and do the types of queries that used to be the purview of data science teams of Walmart type people who had $100 million back-end, data lakes with Hadoop systems and all that. And now you can do this with, very, very cheap, essentially, systems. And then there's this, so this is like, a third of the money people spend on database technology. This is a third of the money people spend on database technology. And this other third is a huge mix of kind of specialized needs. I think this came out of the web scale era too, is that not every problem is solved by the same hammer. And so if you are a Twitter, you're going to have a very specific type of model of how you handle your data stream. You're probably going to invent your own system. But there's going to be other people, there are other use cases, like Cassandra, I believe, was a spin-off of Facebook just handling their messaging aspect, like the direct mailboxes at the time, and now like the messenger-oriented system, when they needed a way to be able to search your existing messages. And having that offline search and indexing capability was a completely different distributed model than sort of their online transactional processing type stuff. So anyway, what do you guys think? Is that an interesting review? Is this kind of stuff that's all Hojam? You've heard this 1,000 times, or am I covering, it's kind of useful to see it from this perspective? I got a thumbs up. That's what my son always I'm not going to do it. So, I'm not the sole authority on this, obviously. It's not like I'm a database company executive or something. But this guy is, he's really kind of, so he was actually on one of my podcasts. I'll put these slides online or something if someone wants to go dig in deeper. But this is like, from a computer scientist perspective, right? If you could be anything like this guy, you'd probably be very, very happy with yourself career-wise. So, in the late 70s, he built these technologies that were like the very early concepts of a database store. And then in the 90s, he built Postgres, and then later, what we'll talk about later, column stores, and then partitioned column stores, H stores, and then SciDB, which is like an array store. And every single one of these academic things, he's an academic his whole life, he spun off into a company, and most of his companies have gone public or gotten bought or have very, very successful lives since he started them, and he sort of stays on as the advisor, etc. So yeah, a lot of his companies have had successful exits, and then just recently he's on the cover of Communications because he received the Turing Award. And if you listen to him talk, I was in the 70s and he's still teaching. He's like, well, eventually, I don't know any professors teaching at the age of 80, so I'll have to retire, but maybe I'll do some more startups or something. Like, just ridiculous guy in terms of his productivity output through his career. But he's also seen and essentially trailblazed a lot of these transitions we just talked about. So really interesting to see how what he's talked about here has now become a whole market. And so one of the things he talked about is that for data warehousing, row-based storage is dead, right? So why do we have role-based storage in the first place? Well, if you get a new credit card transaction on your website, you need to make sure that that's on disk so that the row is consistent. You add a row to a database, and the row contains a tuple, right? This is all relational database 101. What your ID is, your user ID, and the timestamp, and the credit card number, and the expiration date, right? That's great for appending and inserting and updating and deleting. But for warehousing, your state of the world is historic. You're just looking at everything that's already happened, and you're trying to put it into one consistent model that you can query really, really, really fast, and it's really, really efficient to store your data in columns. So put all the credit cards in one array on disk, put all the user IDs in one array, right? And then you can access, if you want to look at, show me credit cards from transactions from this date to this date, or your start date or your transaction date is in one column. You can scan just that column, and without ignoring maybe the terabytes of other data, you don't have to do a full table scan or have it indexed. You basically ignore indexing entirely, because you can every column is its own sort of ready to use index. I mean, indexing would basically just be sorting that column if you want to do really, really quick lookups on it. So all of these data warehouse commercial databases are starting to, well, one, they're all basically column stores now, except for Hive, which is sort of a mess. And they're all also, because they're commercial, I mean, if you were to do this on a laptop, you don't really need a commercial solution. Anything that fits in memory is not technically big data, which seems to be sort of the closest thing to a working definition. They all use MMP, massively parallel processing, but they almost all have gone now to having an SQL or SQL-like front end, because at the end of the day, it's really, really convenient to be able to express your queries in a standardized format that most people can run in a reasonable amount of time. What's different is essentially how people are starting to commercialize this. A lot of these are completely licensed, as in you buy a copy of it and you put it on your own servers or you run it on their servers. That's the $100 million a year starting point type things. But more destructively, you're starting to have things like Redshift, which is fully managed, and Google BigQuery, which is really interesting. It's also fully managed and really impressive. It's very Redshift-like, but it's using its own internal Google, actually in-memory column stores to do its work. So the big question is, and everything was, how many people know what Hadoop is and exactly how a data processing model works? Yes, so we've got some Hadoopers out there. I mean, Hadoop's one of those things, like if you put it on your resume, then like you have like 50 people on LinkedIn trying to recruit you, because it just seems like if you're a big company, you need a lot of Hadoopers to get your work done. And basically, Google published this paper saying, well, the real way we do our scaling of every website in the world is called MapReduce. Computer scientists are like, oh, yeah, MapReduce, we all know that. That's like list 101, right? Divide and conquer and aggregate, all that kind of stuff. But what they showed is that it works really well for this world of commoditized hardwares, distributed data, plus distributed compute. So if you put all your pieces of data on a lot of pieces of commodity hardware, and then you run a tiny little algorithm on that piece of data, and then you roll up those two results from two computers with another computer very quickly, you don't have very much depth on that tree, you can run stuff on petabytes of data very, very quickly, right? And so the open source version of this was HDFS and Hadoop, which is, HDFS stands for Hadoop's distributed data store or something like that. It's basically distributed storage format, so all your data goes into lots of little pieces across your entire cluster instead of just being on file, on a single file on a disk. And those pieces are replicated and they're redundant and all that kind of good stuff. So you could actually build very cheap, large file systems that don't actually have a file system-like presence on a single disk, but exist across the network. And then when you want to do something like, say, show me the people in Salt Lake City that have red cars, you could basically do a group by and a sum across all those systems, and everyone writes a little piece of Java code that goes and runs on one machine, and then another piece of Java code that does the reduce step, and then you run that across your system. It turns out writing Java code to do very simple stuff like that is a really stupid idea. It's not very fast. But it's really smart for doing things really complicated, right? So if you do have to do something really kind of deep learning analytics, that'd be like the one case where that works, but for the most part, big data is used in a small analytics way. It's the title up here. Small analytics is stuff that you can express mostly in SQL. Group by, less than, sum of this, order by this, distinct this, give me a unique set of these. Those types of analytics, even in a distributed environment, if you could put something like SQL, it would be much faster. So here's just Redshift versus Reduce doing a very straightforward query on a 1.2 terabyte tabular data set. And you can see it's like orders of magnitude faster. So pretty much nobody is using MapReduce. In fact, Google's not even using MapReduce. I'm feeding myself. She needs some water. I had a cold for 5 days, so I'm not going to be able to talk for 45 minutes. I'm not joking. So anyway, so what's really interesting is that after all this huge Hadooping world, and it's been taken very seriously by enterprise. I remember going to a sales call as Golden Felix to Monsanto. We drove over to Monsanto's giant campus, and we had our specific piece of software that does our little genomic software thing, and it did all the genomic features they wanted. We were like, well, but does it store its data in Hadoop and does it run in Hadoop? I'm like, well, no, that'd be stupid. Well, our system architect says everything has to be in Hadoop or we can't buy it. Are you serious? Yes. So we're like, okay, it would be like $1 million to rewrite this entirely in Hadoop. Well, we're going to consider that. It's stupid. And I guarantee you, they're not using Hadoop today, but it was all the rage for a couple years ago. So again, on column stores, why are they so awesome? Because not only do you just turn your data storage into data that is the exact same type, that allows you to compress the data really well, right? Because if you have a whole bunch of data that looks very, very similar, it's the same width, or if it's a bunch of floats, they're 4 bytes or 8 bytes. If they're integers, you might have things like run length encoding or other types of ways of compressing them. It also allows you to scan them in a way that's actually faster than looking at every single piece of data individually. So imagine you're doing a query across 1 billion rows where you say, give me the values that are less than 10. Well, if you store this in a columnar store, what actually happens is you store, let's say, 64K chunks, because it doesn't do power 2s, at a time. And at the top of each chunk, you say the minimum value in this chunk of 64,000 records is 50, and the maximum value is, a billion. So you're scanning and looking for any record that's less than 10. You read that first couple bytes of that header, and you ignore the next 64,000. You don't even have to decompress that chunk or look at any of those records, right? Because those 64,000 chunks only range from 50 to a million or whatever, right? So you can actually optimize your queries to do, sort of super linear level pre-indexing type scans. And so you do that, and you also have very flexible storage. And in fact, if you do distributed storage, you end up putting one chunk on this machine and one chunk on that machine, and then replicating it a couple times, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very good model for storing large sets of data, and it ends up looking better than, so for example, the whole reason I'm talking about this so deeply, this is actually something that I kind of came to not knowing about data warehouses, but knowing about how storage was working for scientific computing, very similar, and we ended up building a columnar-based store for genomic data. What was the for example? Oh, compression. So when we actually are storing things that are coming in as text files, we're often importing text files that people use gzip to compress. After I put them into a column store, which actually has a lot of metadata indexing on top of it, they're sometimes smaller than the compressed text files that contain the exact same data, because the compression is so good once you line up data to be the exact same types, all the way through. So it's a fantastic way to store large amounts of data that's essentially write once, read many times. And that ends up being kind of what we do in genomics and life sciences in general. But what ends up happening then is what your online world of data generation looks very different than your offline world, is you have this piece in between, which is often called the ETL, or the extract transform mode. So it's like take it from the online world, transform it into some model, take it to the offline world. And again, you're pulling this data from your HTTP log files, from your Nginx or Apache, or your HA proxy, or your crazy web scale version of that. You're pulling data from whatever your transactions are coming from, your internal and external systems, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to get into that much more. So that's the database side of the talk, and relatively good timing. I'm going to jump into the second half, which is more on the genomic side. So Golden Helix has been building genomic software, and really kind of in a model that defeats what should be possible. Our main competition is free software, or it has been for a long time. So people doing statistical analysis on thousands of samples using relatively cheap genomic assay technology, where you can see lots of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of data points about where individual people differ. You can load that kind of data into giant matrices in our software and run statistical tests to say, is there any genomic trait that is statistically associated with some physical trait, like, do you have wet or dry earwax? And that is actually a government-funded study that has a real result. And based on my 23andMe genotypes, I have wet earwax. And I'm kind of in between, so I don't know how accurate that is. Although, not that I'm an expert, so maybe I have the right phenotype. But this is the type, so this is the type of thing we did, and the world of statistical software had a lot of open source competitors. And literally everything we can do in our software, you can go and find at least one open source software to do it, but somehow we sort of scraped by and made a living. Because we really focused on the user experience, obviously, that's the only way to get people to pay for something. It's like you make their lives better by using your tool versus the alternative. And we were able to do things actually a little more efficiently than the open source software in terms of we could do things in memory, be careful about how much we hold in memory, hold stuff on disk, and have really good visualizations, which were bringing in lots and lots of pieces from lots of different matrices or lots of different data sources. And all that basically made us really good at this kind of data warehousing side of things, because ultimately, genomic data is write once, read many times. You don't get deletes and updates in the middle of your project. You're reading something thoroughly static that's coming out of an experiment and just analyzing the crap out of it. So we were working with these types of large matrices, much like the scale that people would be doing in data warehousing, to the extent that it could fit on a single computer. And then we're learning a lot of this technology as we go. And then something interesting happened. The price of sequencing just dropped like a rock. So all this data we were doing before was based on this really cool piece of technology where you almost would look like a computer chip. You would have a predefined notion of where you want to look at the genome, and you could define a chip to probe like 50,000 of those data points. And for like $50 in today's chip technology, genotyping chip technology, you could probe those 50,000 points in there. And this is still done. It's not so much done in human research as it is still done in like cattle breeding, for example, and Montana is huge on this. My goodness, do we genotype the crap out of our cows. There are data sets like orders of magnitude bigger than all humans ever genotype, and it's just all cows. So we actually we sell our software to cow geneticists and stuff. And apparently Ireland and Scotland too. Really, like those guys are pushing the boundaries. I keep on thinking like, with the next renewal has to come bundled like take Gabe on a wine or a whiskey tour around your cow breeding facility up in Scotland, because that's the only way you're going to get that new feature you kept on asking for or something. But they haven't put that in the contract yet, but I keep on pushing for it. But so that technology has existed since the early 2000s and getting cheaper and cheaper. But the sequencing technology around the mid-2000s, late 2000s, went from being like $100,000 to sequence a genome to like $1,000 or two. And that's pretty crazy, but it's kind of leveled off. And everyone likes to see exponential curves go on forever, but that's not how nature works, right? We know Moore's law is not going to exponentially do this thing forever. It's like there'll be limits. Any exponential curve, Linus Torvalds has a great quote about this. Like any exponential curve observed that has a natural physical reality behind it, it's just the beginning of an S-curve, right? Where it's like flat and then it does a big exponential looking thing and then slowly hits some asymptote and then hits that S-curve aspect. But anyway, so the price of sequencing is leveling off. It may have some technological disruption in the future that does another big drop, but the point is, it's at the price point now, which is really cheap and makes a lot of sense for the clinical guys and the research side to sequence everything as opposed to just genotyping. The difference is you actually get everything in the genome that might be different from something. Yeah?
I have a question. So 23andMe
is genotyping. It's those cheap chips that we use for cows.
So that's like $100 and now you're paying.
Yes, that's the difference. So it's still a lot cheaper to go and look at 100,000 places in the genome that where they are. So you design actually a little. It's kind of like a search string, right? But it's a little called a oligonucleotide probe or whatever. You basically say, here's the beginning part of this sequence, and then this last base changes from one thing to another. It's like a search string for that genome piece, and you do that for 100,000 pre-designed places, and you get that information of just those individual places really cheaply, for like 50 or 100 bucks. Sequencing a genome means taking and reading all 3 billion pieces of base pairs of your DNA, 3.2 I believe is how much humans have, and then comparing that to a reference, and then finding all places that differ, which is on average like 6 or 7 millions for Caucasians, and then like 8 or 9 million for Africans, both because the human reference genome happened to be designed around about 30 people from Buffalo, New York, which not surprisingly look very much like the white Caucasians. But also because Africans, because of their ancestral history, have a lot more diversity. In fact, the differences genomically between like myself and someone from like Northeast Asia is very was like this far compared to 2 people of different tribes in Africa are like this far, like in terms of genomic differences, like millions of mutations versus like hundreds of thousands of mutations. Because essentially there was just a narrow population of people coming out of Africa that then populated the rest of the world. So they have very, only those hundreds of thousands of years of genomic drift between their founders, versus people who are within running distance of each other in Africa have like millions of years of genetic drift between their sort of founder population. So it's really, really interesting. But yeah, genomic differences are read out for every single change, even ones that happened this generation. So when you sequence, I sequenced my son, for example, and I actually found a mutation in his genome that was not in myself and my wife. I sequenced all 3 of us. Actually, there's a couple, but one only interesting one that might have been a gene or so. And that's common, actually. Every generation, there's in the order of 1,000 mutations that occur in your genome at random, and 1 or 2 of those are going to land in portions that code for genes that do stuff that may matter. Thankfully, most of them are very tolerant to those sort of spurious mutations. But this is why it's clinically relevant, because some of those do very dramatic things to a person. And when a baby is born with a very dramatic health defect, it's genetic, 99, like a large percentage of the time. Or it's very obvious that it's not genetic. It could be like, very severe environmental issue. But it's very, if it's genetic, you can actually go and sequence that child and often triage about 40% of the time what's going on. And you wouldn't be able to do that because you can't run all the blood tests and lab tests, and the kid's not old enough to understand all those other lab tests. But taking a little piece of DNA, sequencing their entire genome, and finding out which genes are mutated compared to their parents, this is essentially the new standard of practice for genetic disorders in neonatal units, and especially disorders in kids as they start those developmental milestones. And you start to see things that, as kids, the only way that those things are coming about is essentially from their genetic code, because they haven't had enough environmental impact going on, and sometimes you can rule out that kind of stuff. Yeah? Interesting? Yeah, I mean, the thing about this industry is it's like, this is all within the last 5 years. It feels kind of like computer science at the, there's not really an era that really comes this down, right? But, computer science in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where it goes from, siloed to distributed. That's what's happening with genomics, is like there's only a few institutions that could do this, and now you can buy a sequencer for $50,000 and sequence a significant portion of people's genes for hundreds of dollars a sample. Now, that's like basically the price of any lab equipment. I mean, a freaking blood tester that's automated costs $50,000. So now any hospital can afford to do this. The problem is the complexity of the interpretation is really, really high. Blood test, you put it in the blood, and say, oh yes, one of these, 4 major types and 15 minor types or whatever. And blood screens for this and blood screens for that. You just look for these proteins, look for that proteins, etc. You put in a genetic test, you get back something you've never seen before in the world. Well, what do you do with that, right? You actually have to interpret that in the context of everything else you've seen in the world. So that's actually what we do, is try to pull in those data sets to interpret novel mutations in kids or in trios, etc., etc. And Is this going to 50? Or top of the ish?
50-ish and then
Okay, let's do a little what that looks like. So I talked about DNAs are just these differences between some in your genetic chromosomes versus the baseline, NGS testing. This is why people do testing with NGS. The other thing is, right, if you're about to have a baby, recessive disorders means that, let's say you have a mutation on some important gene like CFTR, which actually, if you and your wife both have a mutation on CFTR, your kid has a 50% chance of inheriting both of those mutations, and if they do, they have a 100% chance of having cystic fibrosis, right? So you want to be able to test for that. And those mutations may be some of the well-categorized ones that are well known, but they might not be. And so things like just sequencing that gene is now really, really cheap. And you'll find any mutation in that gene. And so there are panels that screen pretty much every known gene that has this type of disease model where you and your wife could potentially create a child that has this disease with very, very, very high certainty, and you're playing the odds by having a baby organically like that. And that's like something that you can spend a couple $100 on and get done. So this is like all within the last couple of years, this type of technology is making this type of clinical practice common. But again, you need to know what's out there because you'll see stuff you've never seen before. So these are like catalogs, and a lot of these catalogs are just giant aggregate databases of as many people want to be sequenced that look somewhat normal, right? So this is the largest one. It's got 60,000 people in it that we've sequenced their exomes and put them into a catalog, and it has essentially 10 million unique variant sites. And for every variant, you see how many of those 60,000 people have that mutation. That's super important. One, if 100 or 1,000 people have this, I'm probably not too scared of it killing me, right? Two, if nobody has ever seen it, now I have to do a complete novel analysis. Three, if like 1% of the people have seen it, well, that might actually, 1% of the people are carrying deadly diseases in carrier states, where if they have a partner who also has one of those 1% risk alleles, that could, so it's different contexts become important then. But basically what I'm saying is what we do is we call annotations is pretty much database left joins, a little more complicated than that, between all the variants that I see in the genome and all these databases and pull those into very, very large tables. And what we do with those tables, well, we can look at them not actually in a visual sense. This is actually a mutation in my genome, and here's a scary, this purple means deletion. It's a deletion on one of my two chromosomes, so everything's sort of split in half. There are two chromosomes, one sometimes have a mutation, some don't. Here's where it is in the gene, here's with those populations. It's not in those populations, looks scary and novel, etc. So that's the kind of interpretation you can do visually. You can also essentially do really, really large parallel queries. This is actually a picture of our software, and I have a million variants. This is actually my family's exome data, and I'm running. All these columns are ordered together, so it's like this and this and this and this and this and this, or this and this and this and this, or this and this, and then the file number of all the word stuff is here. But these are actually looking at those different modes of inheritance. So this is looking at things that are recessively inherited, and this is looking at things that occur in my child that don't occur in anybody else. And there's one, I mentioned this one variant. And so it goes through a process of saying, remove variants that are not rare, because if thousands of people have already seen it, who cares? Look at variants that only affect genes that says loss of function, that changes the function of a gene. And look at variants that occur in my son and won't occur in anybody else. There's actually 4 of those. And then look at genes that are known to have some sort of clinical association with disease. We have over 30,000 genes. Quite a few of them, we have no idea what they do. Like if you kill them off, do they do anything with it? But a lot of them, we have a lot of research papers that say, I saw a kid who had this gene deleted or had this gene mutated, and his skin looked like this, and here's a picture of it, or his blood levels look like this, and here's the disease phenotype, etc., etc. So that's how you can kind of do this stuff. All right, so personalized medicine is awesome. We work with this is in our wheelhouse, so this is actually kind of the national stage presence of Obama talking to patients like this guy's father. This is a father of a patient who had a rare disease that was discovered by exome sequencing, much like the same stuff that we do. and they're focusing it on heavily on the other side of it. I thought for fun, I would actually show what this looks like at a software level. So this is my mouse. Here it is. Okay, here's my mouse. So again, this is my trio. So here's a million variants. What we do is actually kind of allow this to be an interactive process. So here's those 4 variants that pass. Actually, change the filter a little bit. So at this point, there was 6.
I don't know if it's actually not that.
Oh, you know what? That's the. PowerPoint lets you take over the way your screens forget. There we go. So here's like a million variants coming in. Each of these little boxes I can expand out. I can actually look at different groups of variants by just toggling on them and add that to a list. That basically changes the and condition to include these things. I mentioned that we're filtering on, is this variant rare? Rare is 0.01 by a frequency, that means 1%. If I wanted to say 2%, you're going to really change that. And it just updates that query on those million rows, and now changes those buckets. It didn't actually change my final result. So it was three variants came through that list, and if I change it back to 1%, it's still 3 variants. But you can actually click around on these things. And when I click on these, it's actually changing. Also, here's that visualization perspective of it. So, that's really fun to feature for that. Say something. But if I click on this variant, it actually jumps to this genomic position, so you can see where that is in a gene. And actually, right here on this path, there's a gene, and I can add in those other annotations, like I mentioned, like these population catalogs. And sure enough, this is in some population catalogs, but it's pretty rare, et cetera, et cetera. And I can zoom out with my mouse and dwell on this. All of this data here, that's generating everything on screen, is coming in through column stores, right? So on disk, I'm just basically storing data in columns, reading what I need to be able to pull in whatever I need for this genomic region, for those filters. Those filters, when it's saying look at things less than 1%, it's just looking at that one column of about 200. And I can do this on my laptop, and I'm looking at tables that have millions of variants in it quite easily. So it's a pretty nifty way to do data analysis. Yeah. Last thing I was going to mention is that this is not. So I don't want my own file format to do all this. Turns out things like Postgres are so well architected. You can do things like, if I wanted to put an SQL query behind that could run on my file format, you can do that if you can basically get an SQL front-end engine to talk to your file format as a regular table. And Postgres has that exact capability. You can write little C plugin modules that sit there and pretend to be a Postgres file. And if you write your little plugin modules right, you can actually do things. Let us switch on over to a little prototype of a web interface. So that exact same file format that was used to essentially do what we just saw in the view of a product that's actually built on top of that file format, we're actually putting behind a Django-based, standard web application that's running a Django warm model that's looking at a Postgres database. That Postgres database is looking at a table that happens to be proxying an actual file that I wrote with our software, and I wrote a little plugin to Postgres to say, oh, here's what a column looks like. If you want to do a query against this, I'll just make that look like your internal file format. And so I can do things like this is basically another filter interface. Like, oh, I want to look at variants that have this filter. I can update my query, or I can remove that query, and then what's that? Dang it! Escape, alt tab, etc. All right, there we go. Now we're looking at this little query interface here. So I can go and look at some columns of these annotations, go and select one of them, add that as a filter, and it says I'll take my 19 variants, and I'll look at those 7 variants, and then pull that results into a separate view. That separate view will look at those as a table, and I can drill into that table, etc. This is the same file format that I was just doing, desktop app stuff. Now it's running through a web app because I was able to essentially abstract away the file format with an SQL front end and then use a standard, web stack. That's cool because web stacks are really prolific and you can do lots of things. Like all these, SQL data warehouse systems are built on essentially assuming you can write a web stack to run some sort of SQL-like engine to query your data. So we're actually spinning this off into a different type of product that looks like a data warehouse. It's just data warehousing all the samples of all the variants you've ever seen, being able to do stuff on it. So anyway, Q&A. No little time left, but that's it. That's my talk. And if you want to, come talk to me afterwards, and also feel free to grab a little flyer about my position for hiring. Any questions? You want to know anything about genomics?
This might be a really naive question,
Yes.
but I'm curious how the analytics that you apply are different from the researchers that are publishing the papers.
Well, it's not actually. We have over 900 citations in peer-reviewed journals. So the statistical work, we do that. The clinical side, people don't publish right away, and often it's sort of a very high latency because they're trying to answer a clinical question right away. What disease did this kid have? Other known treatments for those diseases, etc. Or if it's cancer, you're actually informing how you treat someone's cancer. I mean, cancer is a disease of the genome. It basically occurs when your cells mutate within your body, and those mutations turn off sort of our safety checks. There's a whole bunch of redundancy in biology. But if you kill off a couple of those redundancies at the right points, all of a sudden your cells don't know how to kill themselves, or they just like to consume energy and proliferate like crazy, and you have cancer, right? All that happens because specific mutations occurred, and you can sequence the cancer cells and say, you knocked out this gene. Well, it turns out, or you activated this gene like crazy, right? It turns out there's a drug that just goes in and knocks down that gene. That's so much more effective than giving someone chemotherapy. Chemotherapy will put them on their back and you're essentially attacking every single cell in their body. If you give them that targeted therapy for a gene that's specific to the cancer, they can actually have a full, and this is like, we know how to cure cancer, we just don't always start to give it each person. That's like the quote people are starting to say in the cancer community. We can fully target someone's personalized, mutation. So that's really the new personalized medicine mandala. That quote is still a little optimistic. The problem is, yes, we can go and kill off the primary code. The problem is it's like a genetic algorithm, really, in the true sense. There's a million different other subclones going on, and some of those, as soon as they see sort of an ecological opportunity, you killed off the primary resource sector, they'll proliferate. And now you have a different strain of that cancer, which has a slightly different mutation path that wasn't killed off by a targeted drug, comes back. So essentially, once you have cancer, you always have cancer. It's just a matter of have you kept the primary, problematic strain under control or not. And then hopefully it's a long time before something else kicks in. That's basically the difference between slow and fast cancers is just how aggressive that process is. The fast ones you can never really whack them all fast enough. So, any other questions? Green and black 42, yes.
Yeah, so when you guys moved into the Columnar structure, right, you guys have great improvements. And my question is, are you guys getting, is this serve the purpose completely, or are you guys thinking of taking it further, maybe doing some?
So that's interesting. So one disadvantage of Columnar is it's kind of not efficient for, appends can work, but you can't really insert data into the middle, right? Because the entire rest of the data set needs to be shifted down by one. That's not a problem. I am starting to think about mutability because there's some things that we do like to change. But as long as you're changing stuff and not changing the dimensions, you're fine. No, really what it comes down to is indexing and compression is good. I'm using just gzip, the display algorithm essentially, by default. Really good compression. I'm doing like 10% compression ratios on a lot of data sets, but it's actually kind of slow at really, really large scale. And so you see that Google does a lot of research on compression algorithms. You're like, what? I mean, it's like a solved problem, right? Well, it's not like they're trying to improve compression across the board. It's just they're playing with these performance and cost or performance and size ratios, right? They really, really, really want things to be fast to decompress, for example. And they don't care so much how much it costs to compress, but they also want to find a good balance between how space efficient it is, how fast it is to write, and how fast it is to read. And so I'm starting to play with that too, because I would prefer things to be fast to decompress right now actually a decent amount of CPU is chugging along. It's actually, you know, and here's the thing, like, so disks are relatively slow, but SSDs are not, but still, in order of, compared to RAM, disk is relatively slow. Google's argument is that it's actually faster to store compressed data if you can read it on disk, and then the savings of reading less data. Let's say you store 10 megabytes instead of 100 megabytes. Well, you spend 1/10 the time reading it from disk, and if you can save, if it's less than that other 9/10 of the time latency-wise to decompress it back to 100 megabytes, you've saved overall read throughput. So you can read compressed data faster than you can read uncompressed data, to get into the full uncompressed speed, if your decompression is at a certain speed, right? If your decompression takes longer than it would have taken to read the raw data, you don't have an overall win. So that's kind of where compression algorithms are playing, is they're really trying to figure out how to get the right performance. And these guys, like, when they do benchmarks, like, how many hundreds of megabytes per second can I put through my 12-core machine with everything being parallelized with the thread level? So it's not quite the same world that I live in, but it is an interesting world that they're playing with. The other thing that's kind of changing is just being distributed by nature. And we're explicitly not, because at the end of the day, genomic data is large, but hundreds of millions of variants is not large if it can still fit in memory, then it can't. Like, at least a column if it can fit in memory, you generally need 1 or 2 columns at a time. And if it's not, then get a bigger machine, because you just spent a freaking $1 million sequencing the thing, right? You can afford to buy a decent computer to do some analytics on it. So the price ratio between, like, sequencing and analytics, we don't really need to be distributed. But the funny thing is, Google has a whole branch that is like Google Genomics, and they're like massively distributed, etc. by nature. But to be fair, they're sort of tackling in a very Google-esque fashion, like, what would it be like if we tried to do analytics on every single human in the world, analyzing their whole genome? Like, okay, yes, you need Google scale analytics to do that. But it's Google, so I don't put it past them to try that. They might actually do some. They have this thing called the Human Baseline Project, and they're basically trying to understand what do healthy people look like. Because by and large, when you get grant money to study something, it's not healthy people, right? It's diseased people, and so that's kind of where we look. But we don't have as much of an understanding of, well, if you see all these mutations occurring, well, how many of those also occur very commonly and are all within the realm of what can be a very healthy person. And if you start to look at older people too, like, a lot of crazy things happen in their biology. But again, you have so many, like, backup systems. Like, you can have complete genes knocked out. You can have all kinds of weird protein levels. You can have metabolic issues that look crazy when you're walking around and running marathons. So what they're actually doing is not just genomics, but metagenomics. They're looking at microbiome, basically sequencing there's millions of different species of bacteria in your gut. If you just take a gut sample and throw it into a sequencer, you get to see all of that. And you see every single one of those as a different piece of sequenced DNA. So you can look at those, different type of analytics, and they're looking at blood levels, and they're watching that over time, and they plan to study like people over decades, and then put all that into a Google-esque style giant machine learning predict, probably put, their same algorithm that was able to detect cats on YouTube on it and see what they find. So there's some cool things going on at the large scale. All right, call it a day. All right, thanks everyone.